We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Did you notice, Dennis, in that intro, you're one of the horsemen?
No, I'm not.
You didn't notice it? Oh, I put you... No, I'm dead serious. I made you one of the horsemen. I have you, I have Bob, and then I have Elaine Pagels, and I have Robin Walsh. So I did two guys, two girls. Let's see if I can find this dang thing. I wish I could fast forward it. Anyway, I'll show you in detail someday. You'll pay attention closely. A younger version of you, but nonetheless you.
Good thing. Yeah.
Welcome back. How are you, my friend?
I'm okay, thank you.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to bring you back, do a little quick plug as we get into this and let everybody know. Get you one of his books. Trust me, there's plenty to read here. And if you can't read, you can use them as a weapon to throw at somebody you don't like. Or if your door keeps opening, you can use them as door stoppers. So no matter what, they're useful pragmatically. So don't worry. You can use them for anything you want. I highly recommend you read them, though. There's all sorts of fun stuff in there. So, Dennis, if you don't mind, you've got the Amazon books all over. I think, did I close this here? Okay, there we go. So all these books, I've read most of them at least, or at least began most of them. I'm not going to say I read all of them. I didn't read 2 Shipwrecked Gospels yet. That's a that's the size of my head almost. But yeah, I highly recommend everybody go check out, because Dennis is definitely the scholar who believes that there's Greek literary imitation taking place within the New Testament. And most scholars recognize hints of it maybe in Acts, but Dennis goes way further than that, and he goes to back it up in his books, so be sure to get that. Also, I hope you guys enjoyed my video yesterday made for my wonderful wife, but I have a lot of Patreon episodes that have not made it in the public. I just keep adding more and more, and of course, people who help support me, you won't go to hell. That's number one. I don't know if I should be offering that, because technically nobody who's like me thinks that's true. But either way, I'm going to say it anyway. Help support us out on MythVision, and we have the GoFundMe. I'm trying to get funds to go to Israel in October. Okay, Dennis, you have to answer these questions correctly, and you cannot be wrong at all. Okay? Who is your daddy? No, I'm just kidding. Let's start off with something simple. In the next episode that you and I are going to do with Dr. Price, we're going to go into some art. You sent me some of these pictures. These pictures will end up in your new book, right?
That's right, yeah.
I'm going to hold off to show those. I'm going to hold off and show those in the next show with you and Bob. But tell us about the new book. And then anyone who has questions, feel free to ask. Of course, super chats, skip the line, and you grow wings and all that good stuff too. But anyway, tell us about the new book.
Well, I'm going to start with an unabashed and arrogant claim that my goal in these 2 volumes is to make them the most important books that have ever been published in any language on the Gospels. I'm serious about that. Now, that's not to demean what other people have accomplished, but there has been a huge gap in understanding of how ancient narratives worked, and by the authors of the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. So the first one is a mimetic synopsis of the synoptic Gospels, but it includes my reconstruction of Q, which itself is controversial, and also my translations of Greek poetry and Virgil's Aeneid to show parallels to the Gospels and how the Gospels are interacting with the high literature of the Roman Empire. The second volume is bound with the third, and it's a mimetic synthesis that is a comparison of the Acts of the Apostles with Greek poetry. And the first part of it is Luke's Iliad, where I go through the Iliad and show places where the Acts of the Apostles imitates it. Then Luke's Odyssey, and then finally Luke's Bacchae, with an appendix on Luke's Socrates. The third volume, which is bound with the second, is called a mimetic synopsis of 3 Gospels of John, where I stratify the three compositional layers of the Gospel of John, which other people have argued for, and argue for the first of them as an imitation of the Bacchae. And here's one of the really wonderful pieces of this arrangement. I'm convinced that the Gospel of John was written after Luke Acts and knew what had happened in Acts with Paul becoming a Bacchae-like character, and the author supplemented the Gospels by making Jesus himself a Bacchic-like character. So that really changes the way we've understood the synoptic and Johannine traditions. So basically that's it. Now the artwork is really important, Derek, in my view, because people think that the early Christians were not sophisticated enough to have read Homer and so on. But these myths were in their artwork. They were on the stage. They were imitated and mocked, and they were very well known. And this artwork is an indication of how popular they were. One of the things that I've done with my students is to take images like this and put them in front of them and say, what in the Gospels does this resemble? And one of them is Eurycleia washing the feet of Odysseus. And so people talk about the washing scenes or the anointing scene at Bethany. Or Apollo abandons Hector when he's about to die, and that Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or Polyphemus and Circe. Circe turns Odysseus's men into swine. That's what Jesus does with the demons who infest a caveman who's like Polyphemus. So the artwork is not gratuitous. It's not pretty making. It's to show that these stories are deeply embedded in the culture. And it's fun. Let me tell you one that I think is really quite fascinating. In the Gospel of John, Pilate makes a point of dressing Jesus in a purple himation and having a organic wreath, right? The crown of thorns. In Greek art, frequently Dionysus is depicted with a crown of ivory and a purple himation. And I have a picture of that to illustrate that when Pilate takes Jesus out and says, behold the man, idou anthropos, the reader knows it's an irony that in fact he's depicted like the god Dionysus.
Ooh.
So the artwork is really not gratuitous. It's part of the argument to show how popular these myths were.
Yeah, one of the things about your work that caught my attention as well, because I engage with apologists, and I'm going to get your super chats in a moment here, if you don't mind. Thank you so much, everybody. I mentioned this as I was leaving California when I went and visited you. When we had a vacation of a time up there in the mountains. That was such a blast. Was a lot of Christian apologists, which you see atheists engage and such. Even yourself, you engage with Mike Licona, Christian apologists arguing for the resurrection. They kind of try to ignore inspiration from other cultures, like the ideas came before. And I don't say all, but a lot of these apologists pretend, let's say the Enuma Elish, they copied the Bible. Like there's some radical conservative Christians who think that the Mesopotamian mythology copied the Bible, which is ridiculous. But the point is there's inspiration from the culture, whether there's mimetic genetic connection literally, or if it's well-known stories that have been in the culture, which would be mimetic either way. In some way, it's mimetic. That influence is there, and this is what gets a lot of people to wake up and become more, I guess you'd say, deconvert from radical views of Christianity and become agnostic, skeptics, or a more liberal form of Christian, and recognizing these are literary products by humans. They may be inspired, they may have imagination, they may be all of those things, which we agree.
Sure.
But they don't buy them hook, line, and sinker, literally historical. And what your work did for me was realize this inspiration that we all skeptics all recognize the flood narratives from the Enuma Elish, etc., are used and demythologized into the Bible. You're looking at the Gospels and taking the heart of the whole 9 yards for Christians, and showing how it is also inspired and utilizing the other culture. Again, polytheistic culture kind of taking on a monotheistic frame in a way. If that's kind of an anachronistic for me to use the term, but it's like it's coming into a Jewish context. So here we are again. What's that do to apologetics? What's that do to the Christian literalist who are going, oh, it's only the Bible. The Bible's inspired. Is Homer inspired? Is Euripides the Bacchae inspired? How far are you willing to go? Because once you see your work as evident within the New Testament, the whole world just explodes. You see a whole new angle and you go, whoa, clever, brilliant work of art, not literal, absolute, historical. This is fact. You're going to hell. Get out of my face. Like, anyway, I'm rambling, but would you like to comment on that before I take it?
There's a more liberal Christian way of looking at these things that also is problematic in my view. Namely, that, okay, Jesus didn't walk on water, but there's a spiritual message here that God will protect the disciples when they're in danger. Or, yeah, there wasn't a Gerasene demoniac. That's an extravagant thing, but it shows that God is interested in giving people mental health. So that you get these allegorizations of the Gospels. And the assumption is that these authors and communities were too stupid to know that people don't walk on water, they don't talk to the dead, and so on. And so it's a dumbing down of the gospel tradition. Ironically, these are people who cherish these stories, but dumb down the authors. My position is that these authors are far more sophisticated than we are. So it's not dumbing them down, it's giving them the credence that they deserve because they're involved in a cultural battle, which is understood in antiquity as syncresis. Mm-hmm. That is a comparison of two characters. One is invective to fault the antecedent, and the other is encomium to bless the other. Now, one of the things that I'm going to give a challenge to the people who are chatting, and just kind of put some red meat out there for them to go after.
Are they going to chew this meat? I'm just kidding. Anyway, I'm just I got caught up in your Dionysian book when I said that. Sorry, go ahead.
There are a lot of knee-jerk responses to my work, but what I want to encourage people is to become classicists themselves. I love the New Testament and I love Greek poetry and mythology. And you don't have to choose one over the other. You compare them and understand that they represent different cultural moments, different commitments. And I admire what happens in the Gospels. They're not writing history. They don't intend to. They intend to write counter mythologies with a more compassionate understanding, and one that works for their communities as they carve their identities out in the Roman Empire. So I would insist that my work actually valorizes the New Testament, mm-hmm. And allows us to understand it in a different way. I don't think reading the New Testament is going to give you eternal salvation, but I think it's going to give you a ton of wisdom and an understanding about how human communities work and the importance of narrative in shaping the lives we have.
Well put. Thank you so much, Dennis. Neophyte 1, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Are there any other examples of biographers of historical personages using mimesis of mythic material in their biographies?
Oh, yes, there are lots of examples. I don't think any of them are quite as sustained, but you have Apollonius of Tyana as an example. You have the Alexander Romance as another example. You have Herodotus, who makes a claim that, in fact, he is extending the Homeric legacy by writing prose. So No, there are lots of examples. Those are just a few.
Shout out to Gnostic Informant. I was going to grab my Herodotus here. He said
Well,
it to me.
another example is Christian Apocrypha. The Acts of Andrew clearly does so. The Gospel of Nicodemus does so, and both of those are Orthodox documents. So the Gospel of Nicodemus is rewriting much of the Gospel of John by using the Bacchae, which had inspired the Gospel of John in the first place. The Acts of Andrew is making Andrew a hero who does things very much like Jesus, but in many cases you can see that the author is imitating the very text that inspired the Gospels.
Thank you so much, Neophyte. I hope that was handy, because obviously this is a very important question. People are coming around and recognizing that these are like Roman biographies, though they'll act like these are written like Roman biographies. And I'm not talking about the scholars on your side, Dennis, but even apologists like Mike Licona is coming around saying, look, the Gospels are like Roman biographies. Now they take that to the bank and think, well, these are literal biographies that are actually giving you an accurate account of the life of Jesus from like eyewitnesses and things.
But in my view, they're not biographies at all.
Okay.
And the reason
Correct me. I think I heard this, but go ahead.
No, I don't think they're intended to be biographies in the sense that most people think.
Okay.
The origin of the gospel tradition is not Mark, it's the Q document. And the Q document already is portraying Jesus. It's not a biography, it's a collection of his teachings and his some experiences of challenging Jewish law that is marginalizing so many people. The law and the prophets were until John. After that, the kingdom of God. But already you have some echoes of the Odyssey, believe it or not, but most of it's a rewriting of Deuteronomy. Oh, by the way, when answered this question, Josephus himself, when he writes in the Antiquities about Jewish antiquities, he imitates the Homeric epics occasionally. And I'm not the first person to have seen that, but so that goes on. But once you have the story of Jesus in the Q document portrayed as it is, other people come along and they embellish it. And they embellish it with Greek mythology in order to position the emerging Christian church in a certain way inside of the mythic traditions and cultural furniture of the Greek-speaking Roman Empire.
Thank you so much, Neophyte. Hope that answered your question. Christopher Malloy says, does Dennis believe there was a historical Jesus?
Yes, the word, I don't like the word believe because it assumes that, you have to be a believer to believe in the historical Jesus. No, I really consider myself to be a historian. So does Dennis think there was a historical Jesus? And I say, absolutely, yes. There must have been a historical Jesus. And I think the attempts of mythicists to explain away all of these references to the historical Jesus as some kind of conspiracy of the early church to fabricate a historical person is really nonsense. And Richard Carrier and others are friends of mine. But so I would rephrase the question. Yes, Dennis does think there must have been a historical Jesus.
Okay. Thank you for that super chat and answer. Gnostic Informant, my buddy Neil, thank you for that super chat. I was just showing your book. Do you see any connection between the Orphic Ellucian mysteries to the Gospels?
That's a tricky question. And because Orphism is often related to the cult of Dionysus, I would say, yes, you do have some what I would call Orphic radiation, but I don't see it as mimetic. in its connection. There is one passage, though, in the Gospel of Mark that gives me some pause about Mithraism, which is not a part of the question. But when James and John asked to sit on Jesus's left hand in glory, he says, no, you can't do that. It's reserved for the martyrs. In the cult of Mithras, which was powerful for Roman soldiers who were about to die, you have on either side of a seated or a standing Mithras, it occurs both ways, the Dioscuri, that is, the Castor and Polydeuces. And one of the pieces of art that I portray is where you have Mithras with the god Sol having a meal, sitting down at a meal with the Dioscuri on either side. And this is a cult that is related to death, as the Orphic and Ellucian ministries are too. So I would say that I don't see direct influence by Orphic and Ellucian mysteries, but you certainly have mystery cults in the area. And one could argue that the Christian Eucharist is an esoteric event and so on, a mystical event. And I suppose it is, but I just don't see the mimetic connections. Mm-hmm. And maybe they're there.
Wow. Thank you so much, Neil. Appreciate that. Go subscribe to Gnostic Informant if you haven't already. He's been doing some really good stuff. All right, Neophyte1, thank you for that super chat. Do you believe there is a pre-recorded strata of John's gospel that goes back to the mysterious John Presbyter?
Again, the issue of believing is not for me. The issue is thinking and researching, and that has to do with, probabilities. Yes, I'm sure that there was a early Gospel of John, but I don't think it went back to the presbyter directly. But the second stratum of the Gospel of John surely did. And the reason you can do that is you can see 40 examples of near quotations from 1 John, a few from 2nd and 3rd John, where whoever is putting the gospel together, it makes the Jesus into John the Presbyter, really. He is parroting what you find in the Johannine epistles, so much so that I've sometimes called John 14 the fourth Johannine epistle, because it really, it is related to John the Presbyter, surely. And those quotations go on and on. And by the way, I give those quotations in footnotes in my 3rd volume of the synopsis. So you can see for yourself the wording. Although it's in English, I encourage you to take a look in Greek, where they're even clearer.
I was going to ask this question before we get to the next one. And I'd be interested in asking actually the person who posted this, Absalom, would Dr. Dennis debate Michael Heiser? And the question is, what is the question? That would be what I'd like to know. What would be the question in particular? So I know that Dennis does do debates, but it would matter, of course, what we're discussing and go from there. So, yeah. Do you know anything of Michael Heiser?
I don't. And I'm reluctant to engage in debates. I'd rather have conversations and a mutual exchange of ideas.
Yeah.
To set up a debate is to create an agonism and to highlight the differences between people instead of their similarities. And that I learn from debates. So, it's not that I have the truth and Michael Heiser, whoever he is going to be wrong. But I'm happy to talk to anybody who's a serious intellectual.
Yeah. Sounds good. Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, appreciate your super chat, my friend. Thank you. Homer aside, can you go into Gospels using literary tropes, crucifixion, empty tomb, found in Greek novels of the time, i.e., Charitans or Calero. I hope I'm saying that correct.
Yeah, Sheraton.
Sheraton.
And it's Lucipi and Calero. Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, that's a very good question. And there aren't direct literary connections between the novels and the Gospels for the most part, as far as I can tell. The one example might be Achilles Tatius, who may know the Gospel of John, but I don't want to be dogmatic about it. But the reason that I think your question is so interesting, that in fact the Greek novels are themselves imitations of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is a story of adventures about a man who's separated from his family, who's eager to get home. He has to suffer at sea and pirates and duplicity and keep his identity a secret. And Sobek, you clearly know enough about Greek novels to know that you have these tropes, as you talk about them, that go back to Homer. And the reason that these novels share so many characteristics with themselves, and by the way, with Christian Apocrypha, especially the Acts of the Apostles, the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, is because they're all dipping into the same waters, namely the Odyssey. And by the way, people in antiquity recognize this. This is not a modern judgment. Someone an ancient wrote that Homer is the source of all the rivulets we have in literature. And we're all nurtured by them. And so is Sheraton.
So let's just ask a more specific question. The idea of empty tomb. You don't believe the empty tomb is a literal historical thing. Where do you think it came from? Just to use that as an example.
I had a doctoral dissertation written under me on this topic. And there are lots of empty tomb stories. Some of them are empty because the person dies and their body is lost at sea. And so you still have a tomb for them. This is called a cenotaph. But there are lots of empty tomb stories. Yeah, so you have that as a literary trope there for sure.
Okay. And then crucifixion is just something that you would say there's historical verisimilitude to that in particular, right? Or would you say, as this is saying, literary trope, that a crucifixion is just a literary thing rather than the historical kernel of reality that we're looking at? I don't know.
Well, you have crucifixions, but for pity's sakes, it's not something early Christians would have been happy to claim, that Jesus was punished by the Roman Empire and alienated Jews, and that this is a great deal. I mean, it was a scandal for them. It created cognitive dissonance, as you know, and they really struggled to try to understand the crucifixion. So yes, it's a trope out there, but it's also political reality. How many people were crucified in antiquity? It was a common Roman form of persecution. So and execution. So yes, it's a trope, but it also was a political reality.
Interesting. Neophyte One, thank you for the super chat. Thank you for the answers, Doctor. I'm fascinated how ancient epistemology of history had little regard for historical accuracy as we moderns do. Can I make a comment on why I think this is a great super chat? I got earlier a video was done. One of my buddies, the Godless Engineer, is doing a video about how Bart Ehrman will strawman mythicists. He does this a lot. I mean, he really does. He equates him to like the moon is made of cheese or flat earth or something else. And like, he does this a lot and he doesn't really engage in the material. But while I do recognize he strawmans it, I'm still a historicist. I think there was a guy. But it's almost like, are we looking back at this literature and expecting, because something doesn't look historical based on what we would expect it to be written as, because we want it to be scientifically accurate? Or are we going to look at this and say, there's a lot of liberty in the way they would write these things, and there's still a kernel to this story of a reality of a cultic figure, Jewish in some sense, who's predicting the end of the world is going to happen soon, and the resurrection? These are common things the Qumran sect had. Here's this guy, and it gets mythologized into something more. I could see why it would be easy to fall into the trap of thinking there's nothing here, where some people fall into that trap. But can you maybe dabble in that a little bit, of how they're not writing literal historical, what we would expect in today if we were reading a science book or someone who's writing an actual history today?
It's extremely important to note that there is no single ancient epistemology of history, and there is no single way of crafting the historical narrative. Quintilian is very helpful in telling us how historical writing worked. He tells his people, and these are bilingual students who are hoping to be lawyers. He tells them, look, if you want to write a history, read a lot of Herodotus and read a lot of Xenophon, and then Thucydides, and in Latin, read a lot of Livy. Now, in all three cases, we have people who are writing history and are becoming models for other historical writing, but each of them has mythological or secondary material thrown in. So, for example, Herodotus records mythologies that he hears in Egypt or Scythia or elsewhere, and he sometimes distances himself from them and saying, this is what they say, or I can't believe it, but anyway, here's what it is. And so he's recording it secondhand, which distances himself from it. Thucydides is different. Thucydides was a participant in the wars, and he writes long speeches from these various generals and soldiers that could not have been recorded, and yet they probably have a certain amount of credibility in terms of the dynamics of the warfare and the various parts. And so there's no doubt that he's creating these narratives. But then you get a very important treatise by Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century, in which he's had enough of this mythologizing of history, and he writes on how to write a history. You can see this tension also in Josephus. On the one hand, Josephus is a fine historian. In other cases, he's completely ignores certain things that are in the historical record of the Bible, for example, in order to make everything look better, including Moses. In other cases, he runs into a gap in the biblical narrative, and he has an imitation of Homer in order to fill in the gaps or to embellish a passage to make it more beautiful and compelling. So it's certainly historical writing in antiquity was different from us, but also historical writing in antiquity was different from itself, because you have so many different things going on in historical investigation. Now, behind the question, though, may be an assumption that the authors of the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles thought they were writing history. I don't think they thought we were writing history at all. I think they were writing foundational mythologies for their communities.
Interesting. All right. Thank you for that response. Neophyte came back with another one. He said, sorry, last question. Are there any sayings, events of Jesus in the Gospels that you feel have a high probability of going back to the historic figure?
Yes, I think so. but it all has to be put in the subjunctive mood instead of the imperative or the indicative mood. That is, we can't be quite sure. But there are places where the coherence of the Q document, for example, presents Jesus having a certain understanding of the law, that whether or not they are historically reported, I think they probably do capture the radicalism of Jesus's Judaism. And I actually have in the Two Shipwrecked Gospels 8 pages where I articulate what I think those sayings and some of the events could be. The most important witness, though, are places in the Q document where we have parallels in the Pauline epistles, where Paul occasionally says that he received something from, quote, the Lord, and they appear again in the Q document. Well, Q doesn't know Paul, and Paul doesn't know the Q document, apparently, although some have thought that may be the case. So yes, I think that we can do it, but we have to, these sayings and events are not lying on the surface. They have to be mined. And the way to mine them is to have historical criteria, such as multiple attestation or embarrassment, and these are all problematic criteria, but we would use them otherwise to try to capture, let's say, what are authentic sayings of Socrates, for example.
You know, I keep thinking some of the things that really make me think of a historical guy, if you will, the figure, is this apocalypticism. The more I look at it, I'm like, are we going to invent a fictional character and like have him fail at all the prophecies he could possibly fail at? Or are we going to have a guy who made claims that did not come to pass? If I'm going to make up a figure, I'm not going to have him fail at every turn and then have to have cognitive dissonance, make me redefine all of these aspects of the end, et cetera, or to try and have it pushed on. No, I would have, he got it right the first time, and Joe Schmo said, and it happened. And no, Jesus fails over and over and over. Seems very human to me and not very divine. If he is heavenly and he's completely, you see the aspect. I'm approaching this as a person who sees these voices. Look at Jim Jones. I can't imagine how many people literally left their mother, their father, their sister, their brother, and went and followed this cult leader. And the guy had him drink Kool-Aid to his death, or to their death. Jesus literally says these statements. Now, I know apologists want to paint over them. He doesn't mean hate. He doesn't. The word in Greek is hate. So don't tell me what he doesn't mean. He meant what he meant. And I could see that where he's saying, you know, you need to love this kingdom that I'm preaching, this message I'm telling you, more than your siblings. That sounds like a cult leader.
But we have to be very clear about how to detach Jesus from the Q document, let's say, or Matthew, if you want to go with Matthew priority or whatever. Mm-hmm. So what you can see in the Gospels is that a lot of those embarrassing statements get papered over in Matthew and Luke, or John, actually, because they're scandalous and, you know, predictions don't come to pass. But then where does this energy come from? Does it come from the Q document? Does it come, or does it come from Jesus himself?
Right.
And I think Jesus probably was an apocalypticist. And I'll tell you the primary reason for it is that the ethic of the Q document seems to say it's okay to suffer now because you're going to find a reward in heaven. And that Jesus is coming soon and the end is coming soon and you'll get your rewards, so that suffering is worthwhile. Well, that's a part of an apocalyptic agenda. And so I think Jesus was an apocalypticist, but it really is difficult to detach that from the Q document, which is apocalyptic too.
Thank you so much for that. Festering Boils. How do we know if the Homeric epics available in the first century are the same versions we have today?
Oh, that's a great question. and I've got a great answer, Festering Boils. We know that the Homeric epics in the 3rd century BCE went through a rigorous philological scrutiny in Alexandria, Egypt. And it's the same impulse that brought us the Septuagint, where Jews in Egypt were using some of the same methodologies to codify the Septuagint. So before that time, before the 3rd century, that is between the 7th century and the 3rd century, that includes the time of Plato and Aristotle and so on, the Homeric text did circulate in many different forms. By the time that one gets to the Alexandrian redactions, the text becomes really quite fixed. And no longer do you have oral bards telling stories as often as rhapsodes who memorize all of the Homeric epics and can perform them on demand, but they do it almost all in the canonical version. So yes, there are textual variants, and if you get a good edition of, say, Allen's edition of the Iliad, you'll see that there are a lot of textual variants, but they're relatively minor variants usually. There are a couple of major ones where embarrassing passages get obelized, but most of the time the variants are really quite modest, similar to what you'd have in the New Testament.
What's the oldest, just in that pocket of question, what's the oldest fragment or compilation, if we will, of the Homeric epics that we have? Do you know the oldest to date that we've discovered?
Those are two questions. One is, what is the earliest fragment?
Okay.
And I don't think we have any fragment that goes before the 2nd century BCE. So, but from the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE, we have 800 partial manuscripts of the Homeric epics. We have only 5 of the Septuagint. So it shows how important the Homeric epics were, even in Egypt, and they're probably even more so in Greece and Turkey and so on, but we don't know. But so the text became relatively stable. By the way, if anyone wants to see a magnificent treatment of all of this, you can go to the Kunstmuseum in Vienna. And that's the Art Museum of Vienna. And they have a whole wing that's devoted to Homeric manuscripts. And one of the things you can see there is how Homer was used in schools and what kinds of manuals there would be for education of Homer, and how you have marginalia for Homer, and how you have fragments and exercises that imitate Homer. So Homer was just everywhere, and people acknowledged it. So that's the best I can answer at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Stop Scamming Man. Good to see you here. Thank you for the super chat. Any thoughts on what Judas? Bizarre, he'd see the miracles only to sell Jesus out for some poxy silver, or even for the gospel writer to claim it. Also, that passage saying all 12 go to heaven.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to have to rephrase it because I know what you're getting at. Stops.
Rephrase it. Yeah. Scamming Man.
Scamming Man. Paul knows of the 12, and in the Q document, you have a passage that says, at the very end of Q, when the Son of Man sits in his kingdom and so on, you shall sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. But then Mark comes along and he has a story about Judas betraying Jesus, which ought to disqualify him from being sitting on a throne judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So Matthew comes along and does his best to handle that. And he says, hey, No. Judas committed suicide. He was remorseful. The bad guys are the Jewish high priests. And so because he was so remorseful, he can also be among the 12. And that's how Matthew harmonizes these things. Luke comes along. He says, no, that's not good enough. You have to have a replacement for Judas. And so that's what you have is the lottery in the Acts of the Apostles that chooses Matthias. So he has this passage about the 12 tribes of Israel too, but you've got to have a replacement. Now, what about Judas? Judas is a offshoot of characters in the Odyssey, especially Melanthius, who is the turncoat servant of Odysseus. And I'd have to, go into more depth to show you that. But yeah, he's a made-up character.
Yeah, and I was thinking sorry.
No, and so is Mary Magdalene, so is Joseph of Arimathea, so is Barsabbas Justus. No, not Barsabbas Justus, but Bartimaeus. So yeah, you have a lot of made-up characters, and Judas certainly is one.
I was thinking about the connections to what happened with Joseph, of course, in the Hebrew Bible, and Judas or Judah being the one that wants to sell him out. Of course, that was what I was thinking of. But there could be it's eclectic, where there's multiple sources potentially playing a part. Hit that like button, and the demiurge gets chained to the underworld. Jojo, I saw your question, and yes, I think there may be something to that. I just wanted to make an address there. Moving on to the next super chat here. Neophyte 1. Doctor, keep unlocking more questions. If the Gospels are written as if they were apparent history but are actually myth, how do we define myth?
Oh, that's a very good question. In mythos in Greek simply meant a story. It can actually mean just an utterance. So myth is not to be interpreted something that's false, but is something that is narratively true, but is not historically factual. So I guess that's about as close as I could come.
Thank you so much for that. My buddy Joel Pearson, don't forget to hit the like as well as watching. The algorithm is a harsh master. Absolutely. I'm going up, see if there were any particular. Well, I guess I should read Jojo's statement. He was saying Muhammad, according to the hadith, said the same. So I think there is something going on. We maybe don't have the ancient scriptures. Maybe there was something, and I think it's the idea the end is nigh, very apocalyptic, and that's why I like Shoemaker. He's another academic in Islamic studies, and he points out that. Yes, the rise of this empire by the 7th century, apocalypticism wasn't, forsake this world. We're going into the next one, give up your life now, kind of a Neoplatonic kind of who gives a crap about matter here. But that the apocalypticism was with the rise of an empire, and whoever was the empire that succeeded technically would become the kingdom of God kind of idea. It took on an evolution. I'm looking up here for some of the questions that didn't get super chatted. And if you want to cut in line, feel free to. Let's see. MacTube 729999999. Okay. When Jesus comes back, he will have 144,000 virgin males following him around, according to Revelation 14. What could go wrong? I don't know. I'm reading questions. I saw a question mark. Forgive me. That's kind of a statement / question, but a joke. I think it was a joke. I'm going to take it as a joke. Moving on to, I know there was some troll earlier who was trying to, oh yeah, right here. Sebaz, what's wrong with Derek for him to be so hatred toward religions? And all the way at the top, he said, maybe you can answer. Deep inside, Derek knows Islam is the truth, but he is too Islamophobe to admit it. Dennis, what if a Christian in the chat said, deep inside, Dennis knows Christianity is the truth, but he is too anti-Christian to admit it?
Well, I don't even know how to answer the question. What I find objectionable, Derek, is there anyone in the social media world who's more sympathetic to religion than you are? You have people who are Buddhist, who are Jews, but you're interested in understanding religion academically. I don't think you're anti-Christian. I think you're anti-ignorance about Christian. You don't. You're not trying to tell people they shouldn't be Christian. You got to say you ought to know what you are,
Right.
and you interview people who don't agree with you, and they don't agree with each other. That's quite clear. So I think in the West there is a problem with Islamophobia, and it's very difficult for us in the West to be aware, as we should be, of the way we stereotype Islam. And I think you have shown in some of your broadcasts that we don't know Islam as well as we should, and that we should be more sympathetic to the diversity and the messiness of Islam.
I think
and I don't mean messing it negatively. Yeah.
I think what comes with it is the baggage. It's like, I'll try and use it analogous, like I always do with Christianity. I know Christianity very well. If you talk to a modern day fundamentalist, apologist Christian, and they tell you what Christianity is, and you are going after the source material, you're not interested in interviewing an apologist to get to the truth of Islam, okay? You don't want to find a guy whose entire goal is to try and only convince you of its truth, but get it academically and stuff. That's the stuff that they see as Islamophobic, because I'm looking at critically assessing this information to see what are its human origins. I'm very open about my bias. I say I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't believe Muhammad really received actual revelation, that the Quran comes from heaven, etc. No, the Quran talks about, members who are sleeping for hundreds of years in a cave, where we know this comes from monk stories of Christianity centuries prior to the Quran coming on the scene, or Jesus making clay birds, etc., to come to life. We know that this comes from the Apocrypha of Christianity, etc. Like, come on. That's Islamophobic, according to them, because I'm not accepting their narrative, and they think their version of understanding Islam and their sources are the accurate, true understanding of these things. Just like a Christian apologist today believes that they are telling you the truth of what Christianity is. I know that's a lie. I don't have to guess anymore on this. I know that a Christian apologist is not going to give it to you straight. So I want everyone to know, from whatever version of whatever you think it is, no, I'm not going to buy your priest, pastor, imam, etc.'s narrative. If they have something that fact checks what I'm looking at, and I'm looking at this kind of from secular historical method, then sure, I'll say, you know what, we're on the same page. We agree on this. But at the same time, I'm not buying into the narrative. So there you have it.
Well, I think the way that your audience member phrased it is interesting. It identified the truth of Islam, of being Islamic. I think the issue is not to be confused with Islam as a truthful deposit of reality and what God wants and so on. We have to understand Islam as a social movement. We have to understand it as a religious movement that has a historical background and its own diversity. And to understand Islam and boil it down to a truth of revelation that is different from the revelations of others is really not doing justice to Islam itself.
Yeah. It's just the same fundamentalist kind of trick we see from other people. Sure. Tapora K, thank you for the super chat. I am the Alpha and Omega. Is it possible that the historical Jesus knew or spoke Greek?
Sure, it's possible. I think it's likely, in fact, that many people, Jews at the time, were at least modestly bilingual, maybe even trilingual. So certainly it's possible. But on the other hand, he is most engaged, if we trust the Q document again, with Semitic speaking Jews. And it was the Q document that made Jesus speak Greek first, I guess.
Thank you so much for that. Gnostic informant. Does Dennis think Pythagoras existed?
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. I don't know why I should think he didn't exist. So,
Okay. Neil, thank you so much for that. Joe Pearson, just to hit yours along the way, man. I try. It's hard to see questions that aren't highlighted in color like the super chats, but is there any particular scholar Dennis would like to have a discussion with on your channel? So good question.
well, I enjoyed talking with almost anyone. So, and there are certain people that I certainly learn from more than others. So that would be interesting for me. I think it'd be fun to have a talk with Robin Faith Walsh, for example.
Yes.
Because she doesn't do quite what I do, but I think she recognizes that the gospel authors are more sophisticated than we usually are willing to grant.
Right.
I think it'd be fun to have more of a talk with Bob Price. Even though we're different in many regards, we have mutual admiration for what the other is trying to do. I always enjoy talking with Richard Carrier, with whom I'm having more and more disagreements all the time, the more I read him. So that would be another one. But I'm sure I enjoyed talking with Mark Goodacre. We had a good discussion on the synoptic problem. And yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just writing these down so that I can remember. I do so much. It's hard to remember sometimes what I need to be doing next. So name equals Matt. Thank you for the super chat, Matt. Good to see you here, my friend. Thank you both for doing what you do. I found it all very informative. I'd love to see you all really with Bart Ehrman on this. Oh, wow.
I would like that too.
I would too. Yeah. Yeah, I would. Just to even have you and him have a conversation would be great.
Well, let me tell you a story that I don't know whether Bart would remember this, but I can remember at a professional meeting buttonholing him and telling him about my research, which apparently he's not read, and told him that if I'm right, he's going to have to rewrite his famous introduction to the New Testament on the Gospels. So in my teaching, I actually used his introduction often, but wouldn't have his students read very much about what he had to say about the Gospels, because I thought he was really quite remarkably wrong about that. On the other hand, I find him to be extremely knowledgeable, widely interested in the Bible more than I am. I'm interested primarily in narratives, and really has a good historical ear. And so when his debates, for example, on the resurrection and miracles and so on, I think he's one scholar that I have learned to appreciate, and especially he's a very good textual critic. And so that doesn't show in his podcasts usually, but it shows a good philological kind of classical education, which I think has stood him well.
Yeah, maybe one day we can get him on with you to talk about mimesis, and that would be the real reason to have you on together. To be honest with you, I'd see no other reason other than that to really just finally have it happen. But when could we get him to read a book of yours? That would be another question to ask. So,
well, here's another thing that I think is fascinating. Some of the best biblical scholars I know are declared atheists. Now, that doesn't mean we don't love this literature, or we wouldn't have expended our careers and our money on studying these texts. We love these texts, but to understand them, you have to have more of a humanist appreciation of the way these texts work, the way societies organize themselves, the philosophical questions that come up as well. So when people say, why am I trying to attack the Gospels? I'm trying to understand them. And if anybody's attacked them, it's been the religious right who's abused these texts and make them, say things they could never have said.
Wow. Thank you. Stop Scamming Man. Hi again. What sort of villain did Paul have in mind in 2 Thessalonians when he speaks of man of sin?
Donald Trump.
I was going to say Derek Lambert, but okay, fine.
No, I have no idea, honestly.
So yeah, we're not sure, huh?
But I don't know. Yeah.
Stop Scamming Man. Email me and I'll send that out to some New Testament scholars I have and see what they have to say. We'll probably get a bunch of different voices and see what they say. Thank you for that super chat. Margaret, thank you so much for the super chat. Dr. MacDonald, greetings. I don't understand why you think Jesus has to be historical. I arrived late and maybe I missed how your connection.
Well, obviously, we would need a lot more time to lay out the evidence and so on. But I think you have the James passage in Josephus indicates that Jesus had a brother named James, and he was considered on the margins of Jewish society, which is where the Q document places Jesus. You have Paul, who assumes a historical Jesus born of a woman, for example. But I think the Q document is very difficult to understand if you don't have a real historical person engaging real historical Pharisees about real historical problems about the marginalization of Jewish law. So here's what I think you might want to do, Margaret. I've actually done it myself, and it's been fun. Take a copy of the Gospel of Luke and purge out of it anything that you think is mythological. So you can look at my book and, or books and the things that I would identify in Luke that are mythological and so on. And then what's left over? And what's left over is really quite compelling. It has a Jewish orientation. It is not concerned with mythology. It's not concerned with making Jesus a superhero. It's not having him go to the netherworld or walking on water, but actually engaging in debates over Jewish law. And that is certainly something that smacks to me of a historical antecedent.
Oh yeah, there's just a lot of other things we could get into there. But Margaret, thank you for that super chat. And yeah, maybe one day we devote a whole show in breaking down this whole issue and getting into it. Name equals Matt. Thank you for the super chat. I meant that I'd love to see you both talk with Bart Ehrman on the topic. Yeah, that's what I think we understood what you were trying to get at. Yeah. I would want him to be on there to talk about that, though. I wouldn't want us to derail off of the subject matter. I'd want us to get into, why don't you accept Dennis's his point of view? Like, why aren't you seeing this potentially? And he might say something like, well, when I can explain it using the Hebrew Bible or something, you know what I mean? Like this single origin rather than eclectic, then maybe you can break down this and show him examples where no, but Bart, I don't know. I can already visualize imagining the conversation going and how Bart might respond and how you would go back and forth, but I would love to see that as well. No one was here. Thank you for the super chat. Does the prodigal son parable have a mimetic origin in Homer?
It has a origin actually in the Q document also, where there's a brief parable that appears now in Matthew, but it probably comes from Q, that a man had two sons. One of them said, I'll go out and work in the orchard, Dad, and never goes. And the other says, nope, Dad, I'm not going out there. and does so. So which of these two is vindicated? Well, Luke probably saw that story both in Q and in Matthew, in my view, and expands it so that you have a young man getting a treasury, going off for a long time, has nothing to do with the farm, doesn't want to, he wants to cut loose. He spends his money on prostitutes. He ends up having to eat the corn of the swine that he's feeding, and says, I'd rather be a slave going back home than being here. So I'll just go back and ask my dad to take me as a slave. So he's the son who said, I'm not going to help in the farm. And then he goes back, and what happens? He is celebrated, and the fatted calf and the feast and so on. The older son is the one who says, I've been faithful all the time. And, you never had a fatted calf for me, and so on. And he's the one that is criticized. So, so the prodigal does not have a clear origin in Homer. But think of it. Odysseus goes off for a long time and then comes back. While he's gone, some of his slaves have to eat corn that is fit. They're turned into swine, so they have to eat mast and corn. And Odysseus spends many a love night with Calypso and Circe. So you would say that he squandered he has nothing when he's with the Phaeacians. He's absolutely deprived even of clothing. So you do have some of these echoes of the Odyssey, I think, in the Prodigal Son.
Interesting. Thanks for that question. Name equals Matt. Oh, Mike Licona would be an interesting discussion as well. He seems to be honest with himself, and it would be great to see his reaction to this info. What do you think about that, Dennis? You just debated him on the resurrection.
How do you want me to answer?
Honestly, be honest. I mean, you've already engaged with him. So what are your thoughts? I interviewed him recently. And I felt like he even dodged some of my questions when I asked about, I asked him to be a skeptic, and he's not very good at being a skeptic because he's so oftentimes trying to promote and push why this is true. Tell us, Mike Licona, what do you think?
I think he's a good person. I think he's smart. But I think he's the kind of historian that begins with some privileged truth, and then he goes about and tries to find evidence and arguments to support the position. And I don't think that's true good historiography. So he rummaged through Plutarch, especially the Parallel Lives, looking for historical antecedents and so on. And he did find some things that are pretty interesting. But I don't think he's a true humanist. I don't think he's objective. And I don't want to use the word con because I think that's too harsh, and I wouldn't want to apply that to Mike. And we actually spent some time together that I found to be personally satisfying. So I know he's a good person, but I think he uses history to justify a theological position. And that sounds like a shell game to me. I don't think it's honest. And in the debate that I did with him, I actually found him to be more of a preacher than a historian. So it was very difficult for me to have that conversation with him.
Thank you. And Matt, thanks for that super chat. I really appreciate that. By the way, on that question, would you be interested in having this conversation about mimetic connections, or did you kind of get into that in the debate, or would that be something you'd be?
He just wanted to deny it. So that was part of my position, that you have a very clear reference, imitations of the Odyssey. in the Licona account, and you don't have, and also in Mark's account, actually. And he just didn't want to go there.
Hmm. All right, stop skimming, man. The Gospels call Jesus a carpenter's son, or carpenter, son of a carpenter. I don't see a symbolic reason they'd make it up. Shepherd would be different. What's your take?
The same word that is used for Jesus as a carpenter is used of Odysseus as a carpenter. And in fact, carpentry was understood in antiquity to be a high art. You had to be smart in order to craft a ship. Odysseus was the one who crafted the Trojan horse. Odysseus crafted his own palace. So for Homer to make Odysseus a carpenter, it was to show how smart he was. Mark uses the same word to talk about Jesus as a carpenter, but in that period, to be a carpenter was to be a worker and someone who worked for the government. So they wondered, how can this carpenter have this wisdom and do these miracles? So it's a kind of inversion of the hero as carpenter, but it's the same word that's used for Odysseus and for Jesus. And by the way, the Odysseus and Jesus are both suffering carpenters.
All right. Tapora K, thank you for the super chat. Does Apollonius of Tyana predate Jesus? Are the Gospels borrowing themes and miracles of the wandering sage? Inimemesis.
No, Apollonius of Tyana would have been later.
Just a little after.
Yeah.
Even though it says he was born in I don't know, he's lived till 90 something years old or something, but he's a little bit later. Either way. All right, Alan Bird. If the Bible was written by men, then that makes it one of the world's great pieces of literature. If written by God, then it sucks bricks.
That's a very good comment. I have a rabbi friend who is a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. And he said, here's one of the things that I don't understand about conservative Jews, but I certainly don't understand it about conservative Christians. If you say that God wrote the New Testament through the Holy Spirit or something like that, and it's inspired, it's awful. If you say it was written by humans, it's wonderful. Now, do you want to spend your life trying to explain why the New Testament isn't, explain away all the problems in the New Testament? Or do you want to spend your time learning from the New Testament and enjoying its insights and so on? And so he said, as a rabbi, I don't want to spend my time having to explain that why God killed thousands of people in this battle or another. I'm looking for the human voice that helps me understand why people would have made that story in the first place. Mm-hmm. So this Alan Berg really hit it right on the mark. If God wrote it, it's a problem. If humans wrote it, it's understandable and we can accept it as. Let me give you another story. When I was in Israel, I was working on Hebrew and worked with a scholar at a kibbutz. His name is Eliyahu. And Eliyahu had been a survivor of the Holocaust. And we read Job together in Hebrew. And at the end, I was a Christian fundamentalist at the time. And I said, Eliyahu, I know you're an atheist because of the Holocaust. You had 70 cousins before the war, and you had 2 that survived. And I can understand that. But why are you a student of the Bible? And he said, well, there are 3 reasons. One, it's the literature of my people. The second is, as I read it, I find insight and wisdom and comfort. And third is I'm damn good at it. And I thought that was that really speaks to me, and I find myself pretty much in that camp as a humanist who enjoys these texts, and I don't have to explain why God made so many grammatical mistakes.
Wow. Great. That was really well put, Dennis. Thank you so much for that, Alan. Great question or statement, actually. Great statement. Thank you for that. Tapora K, thank you for that super chat. The Maccabees are responding to Hellenistic Jews. Are these Hellenistic Jews proto-Christians?
No, they're not proto-Christians, and the centuries separate them. But you can say that many of the same social conflicting issues apply to early Christians. That's true.
Wow. This has been so much fun, Dennis. I really want to have you and Bob come on so we can go through this artwork that you sent me that you're going to have in your upcoming book. I also can't imagine where that conversation can go. The audience can steer the direction. That's why I like doing these lives with academics like you. I can talk to you on the phone any moment I want. You might be like, I'm busy, but Dennis, this is important. All right, fine. What? I could ask you, or I could email you any day. But these shows really allow people to put their hands on you in a way. They'll read about you or hear about you through the work, and they love hearing this legend of a figure named Dennis MacDonald or Dionysius MacDonald, who wrote this literature. They get the opportunity to ask these questions. And my good friend Neil over at Gnostic Informants doing the same thing. We're trying to get more people, to touch these academics and to be able to go, I had a question. So one day you might have to go back 20 years, 30 years, maybe 40 if you live, 40. I'm granting that you're going to find the tree of eternal life or something. But anyway, they can clip this and say, I asked a question to their great grandkids or grandkids or whatever and say, I made history. We discussed something valuable in history and my family can see that. That's why I love doing what I do. Didn't know if I ever shared that with you.
No, you're so good at it too.
I just try to be a normal human being I'm into this stuff. I'm weird like that, but I also can understand. I think where this light switch went off for me was the same thing you described, is finding out these are people. And what my adventure in this journey of MythVision, looking for the myth, is why did these humans perceive God this way? Why did they perceive the natural world and have these assumptions? Once you understand how they would have thought about these things, then it really starts to make sense. And it also shows you like a fossil record in a way of our thinking, of where we are now, and hopefully where we can continue to grow and go from here. That's what really interests me, because it was God who wrote this book for me. Even if it was through the human, it was like almost coerced. Like the hand was moved by a ghost that caused them to write these words. And I couldn't imagine these were flawed and human emotions played a role. But now I'm like, hold on. God in the Hebrew Bible, at least certain sources, whether you're priestly source, whatever source you're looking at, God has a body. He's just like other ancient Near Eastern gods. And, just goes on and on some.
Well, I want to add a category that you didn't mention that I think is really important to keep in mind. The issue is not whether God wrote the text or individuals wrote the text and because of their own interests. These people are writing because they want to communicate to readers, and they're related to communities and social realities, so that it's not God or a individual author, but it's these authors that are embedded in communities. In many cases, they're also communities of struggle. And this is true of Islam, it's true of Judaism, it's true of early Christianity. So that when these people are writing, they're writing myths not because they find this as a fun exercise, although I hope they did, and they're not writing it out of personal preference. they're trying to write it over against the great cultural monuments of their time, whether it's for early Christians, it's the Jewish Bible, or whether it's the Homeric epics, or whether it's Greek tragedy or Greek philosophy.
Or Mesopotamian Mesopotamian mythology, where we see Genesis doing that.
But I think it's so important, Derek, to lodge these literary projects in historical situations of real communities that are struggling for identity. A good example is Virgil in what he does in Homeric imitation to give an identity and a foundational mythology for the Roman Empire. And he was remarkably successful. The gospel authors, and especially Luke with the Acts of the Apostles too, are writing foundation mythologies. And it's not because they like these stories. It's because they think their stories situate their communities in ways that are going to be compassionate or fruitful or encouraging or whatever. So I think a humanist interpretation of these texts is not simply that it's an atheist interpretation of the text, but it understands that we as human beings live in societies and that we use mythologies to shape our identities and our values. And that's what these authors are doing. And yeah, they do it with mistakes, and they do it sometimes naively. But I think we can appreciate the energy and the wisdom that goes into the composition of these texts. It's not just that they like to do it. It's that they like to do it for people who are, in some cases, suffering.
Last one. Here we go. Cosmic, thank you so much for the super chat. And the question is, I tried to put this up to be answered, but what impact does the revelation of Gabriel have on the history of Christianity?
I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering. Do me a favor. Are you talking about Daniel, where Gabriel shows up in the book of Daniel? Or are you talking about Gabriel as in 7th century AD? Or, if you will, Islamic tradition, because that's a whole different.
Yeah,
I mean, it's still using the tradition from biblical literature, but nonetheless, it's a different question.
I don't know how to answer.
I'm just seeing if Cosmic can respond, follow up with that. In the meantime, everybody in the chat, look, Gnostic Form says that's a deep but great point. I think he's talking about what you were saying earlier. Thank you so much, Theophilus. Followed Derek about 2 years ago, and I'd have to say he's grown. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Cosmic said early 1st century stele found in 2011. I wonder if there's like a Jewish, how the Jews are viewing Gabriel in this particular time. I'd be interested in knowing. Can you email me what you are discussing here, Cosmic, if you don't mind? My email is derek@mythvisionpodcast.com, or you could just go mythvisionpodcast@gmail.com. My email's down in the description of every video, so you can respond. I'd be happy to look at what you're talking about, and then maybe I can get a response. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, Dr. MacDonald, any final words you'd like to say to our audience before I let you go? And of course, I must say, go get a book. He's only written a little bit, it's not a lot, Seriously, any final words?
I want to plug this volume. These 2 volumes that are coming out, these mimetics synopses. They're not to be heavy-handed in proving mimesis criticism or the existence of Q. They're intended to be reference works that people who are interested in potential parallels in Greek poetry and a conjectural reconstruction of Q can have access to the materials in English and make their own judgments. And that I'm hoping by the end of the year to have that available, each volume for under $50, which is really a big bargain for how much you're getting, honestly. And then sometime after that to make it free as a PDF. And my goal is to not to make any money on it, but to have this available. Unfortunately, the books that you held up, if you were to buy them on Amazon at face value, it would be about $500. And that's unfair. I can't expect anybody to do it, but I can expect them to open a PDF that's free in a year and a half and make their own judgments about. I want to make everybody who is interested in the Gospels amateur classicists, basically. So let's see what happens.
Absolutely. And I hope everybody goes. Check out Dennis's work if you want. When are you trying to publish? Like, when will they be available? Do you have an idea of when you're at least the first one?
I'm hoping by the end of the year. My work will be done by midsummer, and then we have to go through the publication business. But it'll be
okay. Soon. Well, I am excited to plug that, promote that, and of course, we're going to be potentially doing some online courses and maybe get you to really dive deep into doing these. And I know that my buddy Neil, he'll be wanting to promote that on his channel as well. Wow. Final super chat popped in. Hell awaits. Thank you for the massive super chat. Seriously, way to go. I really appreciate the support. There is only one real true God. All hell M Slayer. I'm sitting here reading the letter. I think it's Slayer, Dr. Bart believed. Hold on. What is this? Is that M Slayer M? Dr. Bart believed in the empty tomb was proof of Jesus. Enough said. Spider-Man is therefore is also real, just as over 40% of people believe Superman was real during World War II. I'm having a hard time I literally read that literally. Do you understand the Slayer part?
Do I understand it?
Yeah.
No.
Dr. Bart believed in the empty tomb was proof of Jesus. I don't think he does anymore, at least in the Gospels. But I mean, really confusing. I asked him this the other day, but then he said Spider-Man is there for is also real. Just as over 40% of people believe Superman was real during World War II. I didn't know anything like that. Is that even true?
I can't imagine it is.
People wished Superman was true during war. Go kill the bad guy. Thanks, man. I need to look that up. Thank you for the support. Seriously, hell awaits. I really appreciate it. The Band Slayer, the real true God, all hell. I think it's the Band Slayer. Okay, I'm reading down here, just trying to. He's talking about the Band Slayer. Thank you so much for that support. Thank you for clarifying things, Lord of the Four Corners. And to JoJo's question, as we go, says, how much percent do you think Christianity is man-made? I believe it is 100%. That is, that's my take on it. I'm not going to put 99.19. I'm just going to say 100%. Scooby-Doo in this bad boy. Thank you, Dennis. I love you. And let's do it again with you and Bob soon.
Okay, but to say that it's 100% human is only to say how wonderful it is. What could be more wonderful than being a human being and to be in a world with this diversity and where people take mythologies seriously as a way of crafting meaning? So to say that it's 100% human is only to say it's wonderful.
Yeah, and I would say it depends on the Christianity. Yeah.
Human beings too.
I mean, I know some people who take it all. They take it all as allegory or some personal meaning in their life, kind of stuff, and they're not going around thinking, sis is going to go to hell now. I don't find beauty in doctrines like hell or anything like that. I think it's interesting how humans would have developed these ideas, but I don't find where I'm going. Yeah.
No, that's all I mean too.
Yeah. Tapora K said, "Do you think the gospel?" I got to let you go after this one. People are throwing money at me. I can't say no to money. I mean, do you think the Gospels are copying the 6 elements of Aristotelian tragedy?
No, and the question of Aristotle is really quite fascinating, and I think there are places where the imitation of Homer reminds one of Aristotelian's understanding of tragedy. And I can give a few examples. One would be the woman who anoints Jesus for his burial is similar to the story of Eurycleia in the Odyssey. And that becomes then picked up in the Oresteia, both of Aeschylus and of Euripides. And Sophocles has his version of it as well. And Aristotle compares them. And in his comparison, if he threw the Gospel of Mark in on it, Mark would have actually stood pretty well there. So Aristotle is not a source for the Gospels, but it is a witness to the cultural reception of Homer and Greek tragedy that occasionally is useful.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've lost your way and you don't know how to find yourself, just remember, okay? Just remember, we are MythVision.